Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Mr. Rex Murphy, which is always a pleasure. Rex is a Canadian commentator and author, primarily on Canadian political and social matters. He was the regular host of CBC Radio 1's Cross Country Checkup, a nationwide call-in show, for 21 years before stepping down in September of 2015. He is perhaps Canada's best recognized and most admired, and indeed most loved journalist. Pleasure to see you, Rex. I'm glad we have a chance to talk again.
I think we should go over that bio part where you mentioned most loved. I think there are 3 dogs and 2 cats.
Yeah, well, it's hard to believe if you're loved, but it's definitely the case. So I wanted to talk to you today about the Trudeau government and just exactly what's going on. I thought I might give you a bit of background about exactly why I thought we should talk again. So I've been traveling through the U.S. and Europe for the last 3 months. I think 40 cities in the U.S. and then 14 cities in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I've talked with a lot of people about their attitude towards Canada and how that's changed as a consequence of Trudeau. And so in the U.S., what I noticed in particular was that people, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, were very unhappy with Trudeau's treatment of the trucker convoy, and also shocked, I would say, that he blamed it on the Americans, especially on the Conservatives, and also appalled that he froze bank accounts. That was not a wise move. And then in Europe, I would say Canada's international reputation has taken a vicious hit. People are shocked, I would say, again, at what happened around the trucker convoy, specifically the freezing of the bank accounts. But also there's a fair bit of buzz about the new bill C-11 and the internet censorship. And so I don't think Canadians really are aware of how vicious a hit the reputation of our country has taken under our current Prime Minister. And so I thought I would talk to you about the peculiar times that we seem to find ourselves in Canada. My sense is that we get a scandal every week and have for about 6 months that under normal circumstances would be sufficient to bring down a government.
Yeah. Well, I'll pick you up on a couple of things before I go to the actual scandal point. In reference to Canada's standing either in the U.S. or in Europe, even within the last 3 days, with the decision Roe versus Wade, Mr. Trudeau was in Rwanda, which is not near Quebec, when he commented on the operations of the Supreme Judiciary of the United States on probably the most electric issue in American politics. And here's what he had to say. I actually brought the paper with me. I'm only quoting a small bit of it. Here he is commenting on, and this is very important, he's commenting on the Supreme Court, 1/3 of the constitutional government of the United States, an equal party to Congress and the executive. And this is a prime minister in a separate country. And here's his first response to the decision. The news coming out of the United States is horrific. I pause there. Never mind the particular issue. He's saying that the operation, judgment, determination, and rumination of a court, of a judiciary, of the judicature of the United States, the constitutional balance part, he's commenting on the operation of the essential element of government, and especially on the judges, and he's calling it horrific. Number 2, he goes on. Now he's going to what he would call substance. My heart goes out to the millions of American women who are now set to lose their legal right to an abortion. The last phrase is patently false, but the biggest thing there is, who was he to play the Bill Clinton empathizer to the constituents of another nation? Now, if you were telling me he's earned a bad reputation in the United States because of blaming American right-wing authorities for bringing money into the convoy, which was proven false. The majority and by far of the money that went to the convoy came from ordinary donors in Canada. But every time Trudeau has a problem in Canada, he looks to the right wing of the United States as his convenient villain. But what do you think he's going to do now when the people in the United States and in the government, Democrats should be pissed with this as well? He's saying that the United States Supreme Court is an agency of horrific decisions and implying that they're deliberately bringing great pain to American women and stirring up anger. And I'll tap that off by pointing out one other thing. You've already had a night of rage. You've had people storming the private houses of the U.S. Supreme Court. You've had an institution burnt down. You've had the legislature, I think it was in Arizona, invaded so that the police had to. Well, you know, if it were a reverse situation, words of encouragement from an outside prime minister saying that the decision was horrific and that it's going to cause anger on an issue this hot, that was grotesquely irresponsible. And if we're going to blame people's actions on public words, which is a liberal thing to do, then part of the mayhem that we're going to see in the United States over this decision comes from encouragement from our dilettante prime minister here in Canada.
Well, I also don't understand it strategically in some real sense, because it looks self-evident that the Democrats are going to face a catastrophic electoral defeat in the fall. And that means that the Trudeau government, assuming it lasts the next 2 or 3 years that it's hypothetically likely to last, is going to be dealing with a much more conservative ally on the Southern Front. And the steps taken to alienate all those people, especially after he also blamed the MAGA-type Republicans for funding the trucker convoy to destabilize Canadian democracy, just doesn't seem like the most diplomatic or wise thing to do when you're dealing with people who are, well, crucial to us on the trading front, let's say, and not say nothing of defense.
Well, one thing you don't look for in the pronouncements of Mr. Trudeau is wisdom. That's a ridiculous effort to begin with, and it will give you no results whatsoever. What you should look for, and which he's given evidence of over the last 7 years, that what he might lack in intellectual sweep, he more than compensates by a certain instinct of cunning. And the reason for slamming Roe versus Wade is that he thinks he's found yet another issue, even though it's in another country, and even though the judicial determinations of the U.S. Supreme Court have no valence or relevance to Canadians, nonetheless, it's the kind of, it's the kind of raw meat, to use an expression he likes a lot when he applies it to the kind of raw meat you throw out. I found it even more annoying that here you are in Rwanda, on your way to a castle in Bavaria, being hit by this RCMP scandal, and you got to jump out of your chair 3 minutes after the Supreme Court decision is announced to let the world know you think their deliberation was horrific, to stir up the already angry hard leftists in the United States, and detract from any attention being paid to issues in Canada, like inflation, gasoline prices, food prices, the closing of Parliament. But I won't go on with those until we get to them.
Let's start with the issue of the strange political times that we seem to be in Canada, and perhaps touch on the collusion of the NDP and the media in producing that. Because my sense is, as I mentioned before, that over the span of my life, one of the great advantages of a parliamentary system is that when a government, especially one that doesn't have a strong majority, becomes continually scandal-ridden, that the precedent is for Parliament to dissolve and for an election to take place. Now, I know we just had an election that was completely unnecessary, but we have a situation in Canada where the Liberals have moved radically to the left. They've supplanted the NDP, who are supporting them constantly in what is essentially a coalition government. And we have the horrible fascistic spectacle of the Canadian government radically subsidizing the legacy media in Canada in general, and the CBC specifically, to the tune of $1.2 billion a year to produce no audience and a set of facts that are entirely convenient to the Trudeau government. And so we have this perfect storm, especially if you add to that the fact that Trudeau has essentially gutted Parliament for 2 years, partly as a consequence in principle of the COVID scandal. But they just announced this week or last week that virtual Parliament is going to continue for another year, this is just every week there's something else the Trudeau government does that I find so preposterous and unbelievable that it makes me think that there's something wrong with the way that I'm looking at the news. Like, what the hell's going on with the virtual parliament? What is this?
Well, I'll take the virtual parliament first, but I am going to circle back to another thing that several things you've already mentioned. I thought, for what it's worth, and insofar as I can think, I thought that even when the pandemic was fresh and we didn't have a clear understanding of its true risks or its true range, or whether the vaccines or other emoluments were going to be available, I thought that even then, when at least the grocery store clerks were still on the job, and at that time, by the way, so were the much praised truckers. Mr. Trudeau himself came out to say we must thank them for bringing our food and our medicines in the beginning of this pandemic. I thought even then that the idea that the people who had been elected to the highest office that this country can offer, the House of Commons, in a time of emergency, that's when they do meet. And even if there was some element of risk involved, that's when they do meet. Now, that was at the beginning. Now, you drop down 2 years, and the vacillating regime of COVID, it went up, it went down, they changed this, they changed that. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask. These are good, these are good. Take one vaccine, take 2 vaccines, take 2 more booster shots, stay 6 feet apart. Don't take, after 2 whole years, when they finally concede that their own mismanagement can't continue forever. The idea that as he closes down Parliament on June the 22nd of 2022, in not coalition, in collusion with Mr. Singh, he announces in advance that this already gutted, eviscerated, disemboweled Parliament of the last 2 years is now going to have another full year with people sitting in their washrooms in some cases, going on Zoom. There's a side point to this, and it's important to make it. Just because you have the MPs talking to each other by some teleconference, that's not Parliament. The reason that Parliament stands and the reasons that Parliament always were, they are places of assembly. The Newfoundland House, for example, actually wears the etymological force. It is the House of Assembly. And why do you talk of assembly? Canada is vast. Its geography is almost its defeat. And therefore, because of its vastness, the various regions, personalities, and cultures of those regions are vastly dissonant, different, to use a Trudeau term, diverse. It's important for MPs from all over the country to be in one place for a continuous time, to have interaction, response, and mutual communication, even if it's argument. They have to learn from each other the whole of the country. You don't do that with a Zoom on your bookcase.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about on the Putin front is that one of the consequences of the COVID lockdowns is that world leaders haven't had a chance to meet face to face. And now we've substituted Zoom for that, and Zoom is a narrow channel. Now, I've been in Washington too, and increasingly the congressmen in Washington don't move to Washington, and 40% of them sleep in their offices. They don't have apartment buildings, and so they haven't built the social communities in Washington that would enable the Democrats to talk to one another, or the Democrats to talk to the Republicans across the aisle in the social interactions that you have if you generate a shared community.
Exactly.
And so this rush to substitute narrow channels of electronic communication merely out of convenience, we have absolutely no idea whatsoever what that will do to the Parliament. And it could easily destroy it.
Well, I'll tell you what. It already does it to Parliament. Zoom Parliament is a ghost. It is the ghost of a dead Parliament. The notion of again, the 300 plus MPs being forced by the nature of the country to be in Ottawa, to be in one huge building, to share the same chamber, to meet each other informally. That's how they inform themselves of the range and nature of the country. Number two, as you just point out, the idea, once you get there, you get this interaction. The fraud politics of the United States are partially because these people don't simply meet. It's very easy to form enemies on Twitter and Facebook and via Zoom. But if you sit down and have a meal, even with a person who wildly disagrees with you, and you have to exchange the normal human courtesies, you suddenly modify this visceral response that you throw out so rudely on this ghost network of Twitter and Facebook and Zoom.
What you seem to see on the electronic communication front is that differences get highlighted and similarities vanish. And it is definitely the case that if you sit down with someone for a meal, or if your kids are on the same baseball team, that you find out that you're really about 90% the same and 10% different. And when the channels of communication are narrowed, that inverts and flips. And then we also could add to that, Rex, the fact that, well, Parliament's a check on executive power, and we could use some checks on Trudeau's power, but when you and I were much younger, and maybe only about 20 years ago, the press was also an independent check. And now the press is in the pockets of the government. And I called that fascist earlier, and I meant that. What we're seeing worldwide is a fascist enterprise, weirdly enough, on the left side, that involves a collusion between media, technology, and government. And fascism, the root of the word fascism, means to bind together. And the central, right, exactly. The central element of a fascist state is collusion of the elites, let's say, and the eradication of any checks and balances. And that's reminiscent to me of the desirability of that is reminiscent to me of Trudeau's express admiration for the Chinese Communist Party and its efficiency in moving forward, let's say, on the environmental front, something that he's expressed explicit admiration for. And I would also say that's hurting Canada's international reputation in ways that Canadians just don't seem to realize, including among moderate liberal types.
Well, let's go first with the media and the fact that the media, the main media in this country, legacy, call them what you will, have accepted a devil's handshake. It simply cannot be otherwise said that the press, the media, the instruments of inquiry, skepticism, and test can be directly subsidized by the one major institution, the whole government, which in many ways they are charged by their very nature to investigate, to be skeptical about, to inquire, to collide with, to contest. And the idea that in this soft environment, you accept huge sums of money. And by the way, the traffic between the news media and the political media, how many journalists ended up as aides to the ministers? Well, Mr. Trudeau's chief aide, Ben Chin, began on a Toronto media station. The cross currents between journalism and politics, that's one thing. Now, by the way, in addition to the money, that's a really big thing, and it should be a shock to any journalist. Here's another thing that gives you an even deeper, and I think in certain ways, a more worrisome collusion. And that is that the mindset of the majority, and I'm not one of these conspiracy people about the press, but I know it enough from 25 or 26 years in it, that the mindset, the mentality, the tendency, the major media offices of Parliament Hill are already in tune with the agenda of the government. They are constantly, either indirectly, subtly, or not so subtly, actually supporting the government and making themselves the opposition to the opposition. It is really quite remarkable with the RCMP scandals, with Emergency Act, with truckers, with inflation, with oil, that Pierre Poilievre, who is still an outsider looking in, gets a lot of hits. He's going to tear Canada apart. Whereas this giant media, it's because they share the agenda. They share the social identities business. They certainly share the diversity thing, the obsession with racialist politics, and of course, the absorption entirely on the idea of sexual identity and proto. In other words, all of the social justice issues, the press and the parliament are in the same place. So, yeah, being paid for is fascistic. And finally, that Trudeau with the China thing, that's very good. When he was not yet leader, and when he felt he could relax so easily and talk about these things, that's what we call the Kinsey gaffe. You say the thing you really mean, And in his case, if we were China, I could turn the environment around on a dime. The real thing there is not so much the dictatorship of China. It shows that he has a fondness for the ability to merely operate by fiat. And if you study the last 5 and 6 years, and in particular the period from COVID on, COVID was a continuous fiat that completely gutted the civil rights, the Charter of Rights. He has people fired, and then when the convoy comes, he calls them racists, homophobes, misogynists, a fringe minority that should not, note this word, that should not be tolerated. His empathy for China basically constitutes one element of the personality. He does not like opposition. He guts Parliament to make sure that there isn't any, and he makes a deal. He makes a deal with his co-signer, Mr. Singh, so that there will never be a confidence motion. And if he wants to have Parliament Zoom for another year, Mr. Singh is there with the ready salute and the genuflection to give it to him.
Yeah, well, this certainty of compulsion, let's say, that drives Trudeau forward seems to be rooted in his false moral sense that because he's concerned, like the other members of the Davos World Economic Forum, etc., with the long-term health of the planet, whatever that means, that nothing that gets in his way could possibly be regarded as ethical or moral. And the press, who's now more than ever made up of political globalist utopian wannabes, do everything they possibly can to collude and to move that agenda forward. And then we could add to that, Rex, I went through this new bill, C-11, because I'm one of the people whom it will hypothetically affect, although I have a number of maneuvers up my sleeve, so to speak, to bypass that entirely. And I know Canadians don't understand this, but let's say that the new media, which is the internet itself, was capable of producing some of the opposition to the globalists and Trudeau that the legacy media have abandoned. And I'm thinking of people like, say, Russell Brand, who's on the left, and not to mention, any of the conservative commentators in the United States. But now what the Bill C-11 has done is basically, and this is unbelievable, I can't believe I read it correctly, they basically defined all internet content of any sort as subject to the same CRTC, Canadian Radio and Television, corporation? I don't remember the last word of that acronym.
It doesn't really matter.
No, it doesn't matter. They've defined them as broadcasters that are equivalent, let's say, to CBC or CTV. Now, the reason that those broadcasters are different was because the government had to parse up the airwaves, because the airwaves were actually a scarce resource. Now, and the internet is not a scarce resource. And now, as far as I can tell, reading Bill C-11, which is an unbelievably vague document, if a internet service provider, a private one, so a small business person like me, let's say, doesn't broadcast in French and English and in indigenous languages and to any diverse range of people with disabilities and highlight Canadian content, then the government can do what it needs to do to deprioritize their distribution. And they'll do that by putting pressure on the search engine providers like YouTube and Google, or just stopping them altogether. And I read this bill, and all of it, again, Rex, too, the bill is couched in all this diversity, inclusivity, and equity terminology, which it's the same solution to every problem, right? And so not only do we have this massive press collusion with the government that's absolutely unconscionable in a Western democracy, but we also have now the government clamping down more viciously than in any other developed country on the freedom for Canadians to get access to all of the information on the internet, not just that produced by Canadians.
I'm inclined to believe that this idea that these intellectuals, it's mainly a shallow cabinet. I don't care how condescending that sounds, but it mainly is. That they somehow or other have been given Vatican-like infallibility to judge what is correct and is not correct, to make decisions that will hold back. By the way, the whole idea of disinformation and misinformation coming out of the mouths of this government. I mean, they are the greatest purveyor of confusion and evasion and the idea that they then are going to be the kind of grandmas or Mrs. Grundy, as it used to be called in the 19th century, and protect the tender sensibilities of minds that are better than their own. I'm tired of people, and I'm sure you are too, because it's getting so cliched, to bringing up George Orwell, but because he put the stamp on it and gave the template. The idea that a central authority runs thought and speech and makes judgments on what is and what's not. And under the banner of diversity, inclusion, and equity, which is really a hidden ideology pumped up by vast self-righteousness and granting pseudo-infallibility to those who are sensitive. We know this is not the case. Mr. Trudeau got rid of his only Aboriginal female minister. There's equity, there's diversity. They confuse, this is a big point too, they confuse either at Davos, which you referenced, or at any other high meeting, with saying that you are virtuous is the same thing as being it. And there's there's a blatant arrogance attached to any government that thinks that in the modern communication system, that it should have any business outside of the exact things that are defined by law as incitement and real rabid hate. They will call hate something they simply don't like. It's not an easy emotion to define. C11, as Michael Geist, and I know you follow him. Michael Geist is the professor of communication who most articulately and most deeply is warning over and over to give this bunch that can't issue a passport, that have a pay system for their own civil servants that's 3 or 4 years misfunctioning, that can't let passengers walk out of Peterson Airport within less than 24 hours, should suddenly have the government of the thoughts and reactions and speeches and positions and films and talks like this, like yours. It's absurd, but it's more than that. This is truly frightening. I mean, what is this gulping for more power than you need? Well, it's the imposition of an ideology. And to go back to your China point, here's the reason that he may really admire China, because China, it happens to be communism in that case. China is fired only, as was Russia, by an ideology, by a set of narrow ideas from which no deviation, no criticism, under penalty of exile or death is allowed. Not as hard over here, but DIE is an ideology, and ideology makes those claims and fills those who hold it with a completely unacceptable level of moral certitude, not certainty. Bill C-11 is a disaster, and one more quick point. It is shameful. It is shameful to the essence that the main Canadian press are not as one voice and one intense voice saying, we're not having this. We are simply not having this. You are not going to rule on what is information and not information. You are not going to rule on the presence of citizens on the new channels of communication. And seeing you've already fouled the official or legacy means to some serious degree, we're certainly not going to allow you to put a pillow over the mouth of the only possible new exchanges that we have. It's a terrible idea, and apart from arrogance, righteousness, and the belief in his own infallibility, I can't see why. But why aren't the MPs even in his own party saying, Justin, you're dreaming, you're out of touch, we don't want to go there, we're not following you on this? Where's the courage in any of these caucuses?
They hand wave about diversity, inclusivity, equity, the environment, and then in Bill C-11 they add the protection of the Canadian culture to that, and which sounds like something taken out of like 1979 or 1980. It's such an outdated idea. And one of the other terrifying things about Bill C-11 is that we won't, in Canada, if this is actually enforced, with the collusion, let's say, of Google and YouTube and so forth, and the forced collusion in some sense, because those companies are not going to break the law, Canadians won't even know what information is being hidden from them, because the laws will take the form of invisible algorithms that merely deprioritize at the listing of content that doesn't meet the impossible criteria that have been laid down. And Bill C-11 is basically written in a way that allows the government to interfere with the promulgation of any information that they deem unacceptable for any reason, because there are so many restrictions on what you're allowed to do now that there's no possible way that any member of the alternative media can meet the criteria. It's just not possible. And it won't just be YouTube broadcasters and podcasters. It's going to be people who provide all sorts of services online, because the bill is written in such a vast manner that the provision of any services on the internet, and we're talking about the internet here, right, which is something people really depend on, that'll all fall under the invisible auspices of a tiny coterie of ideologically addled bureaucrats and algorithms.
There are so many points to make in this. As long as this is 2022, I haven't got the year exactly right, but 1637, 1640, or somewhere near that, it was when Milton wrote Areopagitica, which is when Parliament of Great Britain was deciding then that, scurrilous pamphlets, usually of religious orientation, had to be prohibited, had to be censored. And of all the great speeches about free expression, the value of books, the value of publication, of all the defenses of real free speech and real free thought, the Areopagitica is classic. And as Milton says, whoever knew truth to be defeated in an open contest. Now that's 1637. This is 2022. And how it can come to pass that a government with a military power, with the ability to imprison, we were making fun of or scared by the big tech companies, Google slanting its search machine, Twitter deciding who should be banned and who should not be banned, who should be suspended and who should not be suspended. We didn't like it when the private enterprise operators, did they make deals with China? How does Google and Facebook and Twitter work in those environments? We said, my Lord, a couple of guys from the tech valley ruling which thoughts can get on platforms and which cannot. We thought that was it still is pretty bad. But now you have, as Michael Geist said, this is an alarming thing, because Geist is a very calm individual. He's a solid intellectual. And on this subject in particular, he knows what he's saying. We have the only legislation in this arena that parallels, get ready for it, North Korea. You pile all this on, and by the way, there's another reason why.
Well, that's a new first for Canada.
Yeah, but let's tie this together. Why do you think he thought it was very useful to have a Zoom parliament for another year? Because the gathering together of all the people who might wake up to this, and who might, because of personal interactions across the lines, might see that this is not a step too far. This is a gigantic leap between mountain peaks too far. No, he wants the parliament closed down or, as I said, emasculated, so that he can bring in his this is his last term. I'll make that a declarative statement. Whatever big moves he wishes to make. But again, in this particular case, we've had it, as I said, we go back to further Milton even. You don't let power determine information, thought, and speech.
This episode was sponsored by Shopify. Did you know that every 28 seconds, an entrepreneur makes their first sale on Shopify? With inflation rising, it's a great time to think about extra revenue streams. Putting yourself out there can be scary for sure, but it opens doors you wouldn't expect, on top of the really nice passive income stream. Our brains use a lot of the same circuits for anxiety and excitement, for what it's worth. I have no idea how reassuring that actually is. Shopify lets you launch your dream business and sell to customers all over the world. They power over 1.7 million entrepreneurs with resources that were once reserved for huge companies. That's extremely empowering, especially when you know Shopify's got your back with the nicest 24/7 support team I've ever spoken with. Start today. Customize your store with zero coding or design experience. Then learn from Shopify's many, many features, all built with your success in mind. Start building your next revenue stream. Go to shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase, for a free 14-day trial and get full access to Shopify's entire suite of features. Start selling on Shopify today. Go to shopify.com/JBP right now. Shopify.com/JBP.
I mean, if Donald Trump were president and decided to regulate the internet, 9/10 of the world would fly up. Justin could go on about how horrific the justice system of the Supreme Court is, while up here he plays a game halfway between Animal Farm and 1984. By the way, he's making, so, as you pointed out, there are so many scandals that one gulps and swallows the other. He has a scandal management that's better than any other. Have a fresh scandal, and then we'll kill the previous one. It's hard to follow him.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Well, exactly. Well, you asked a little earlier what scandal we should perhaps focus on most intently, and it is very difficult to do that when they're coming at you at a mile a minute, when you have like 15 things that have been done in the last 6 months that should have caused the collapse of the government. But I would say the worst thing that Trudeau did, it's a hybrid between invoking and then rescinding the Emergencies Act for no reason whatsoever. Then he relied on the information provided to him deceitfully by CBC, who retracted it, and then, worst of all, freezing the bank accounts and interfering with the Bitcoin exchanges, because Trudeau established a precedent now that should terrify Canadians of any political engagement whatsoever, which is that if you happen to be peripherally involved with a demonstration, no matter how legal the demonstration is at the moment, and you donate money, that first of all, you'll be tracked, and that's bad enough. Like, that's terrifying enough. But not only tracked, but that all your ability to interact with the entire economic system, because it's not just freezing your bank accounts, right? It's freezing your mortgage. It's freezing your visa. It's making it impossible for you to withdraw any cash. It's putting your family at risk. It's to compare this to what the Chinese are doing with the social credit system is no leap. And that's a terrible conspiratorial thing to say, but it also reflects a deep underlying reality. And I'm telling you, I can't tell you how many people have expressed shock and dismay to me throughout the United States and through Europe about the fact that Trudeau, implemented the Emergencies Act and suspended civil liberties and then froze the bank accounts, especially because Canada has had a great reputation on the financial front for 150 years. The integrity of our financial system, including our banks, has been one thing that Canada really got right. And now, what would you think if you were a foreign investor or anyone seriously considering doing business with Canada, when you know now that if you're a Republican, and heaven forbid a Trump supporter, but a Republican even, that your views are now deemed so extreme that it's meet and just to declare them an emergency and to steal all your money with no trial, with no due process of law, completely arbitrarily and behind the scenes. Scotiabank apologized about 2 weeks ago. I don't know if any of the other big banks did.
No, they haven't.
But they said they did it under duress. Well, that's because they're bloody cowards, and they're foolish as well, because they've taken a catastrophic hit to their international reputation.
Well, I'll go back to where you began yourself. The imposition of revocation before ratification of the Emergency Act that had about 7 to 8 days of life. We have not had yet, we didn't have it then, that's for sure. We have not had yet the list of circumstances that justified, that's a really big word, gave justice to the action that justified the imposition of the equivalent of the War Measures Act, because that's what it was, to completely suspend the Charter of Rights on a philosophic basis alone. He basically nullified the entire civil liberties of the entire population of this entire country because some trucks were parked on an Ottawa street. That's only the first part. You mentioned the CBC reports that have been dismissed and that he relied on them. I'm not sure that's entirely the case. He may have had some of his own spin masters passed the stories on to CBC in the first place. I have no idea if that was true or not. But we had other instances where you had an arson attempt in a building in Ottawa, which was dramatically enhanced by news coverage. And Mendocino, or whatever his name is, used that. They're going to burn down buildings and lock the doors so people can't get out. We need an emergency act. You had all sorts of fabricated, false, or totally misleading assertions during a pseudo-crisis. And then you had the capstone, that these people who drove 2,500 miles in February across the northern landscape to protest a given government issue actually were there and had to be paid attention to because they wanted to overthrow the Canadian government. That statement is so extreme that it is beyond laughable. And so when he hauls it back before the Senate gets a chance to ratify it, the legislation says you must have an inquiry when you call out the highest, the most lethal, the thermonuclear legislation of any government. He can't avoid having a committee set up. And I think it was last week or 10 days ago that Chrystia Freeland, who is the deputy prime minister, because Jagmeet Singh is the official deputy, she's finally before a parliamentary committee. And when they ask her questions either about the RCMP or about this or about that, the scorn and righteousness and smugness of response. The idea that the greatest invasion of civil liberties has been passed by with so mellow a response. And that gives them the appetite then, if I can call up the Emergency Act and call a group of savvy, common sense citizens, fringe, minority, racist, if I can set one part of the community against the other, that division, there's where the appetite comes for Bill C-11. Got away with the Emergency Act. Well, obviously I can bring in legislation that is even more toxic. Oh, yes. I can interfere with RCMP investigations because it seems when I went to the Aga Khan and violated all the ethics provision, the RCMP then said, well, that might be criminal, but we're not considering criminal charges. Jagmeet Singh is at the center of a lot of this, and that's a point that eventually we will get to, I'm sure. But the Emergency Act is, I think, because it's not justified, because it was for political convenience, because he extemporized a narrative that these were villains and Americans and were being funded by dark right-wing forces from outside the country. That's the worst, because it confounds so many issues together.
Well, it's also a stunning accusation.
Yeah, it is.
Levied against 50% of the population of our greatest ally to the south. People in principle that he has to work with, or certainly is going to have to work with when the fall comes. And so that's just another example of his stunning lack of wisdom and his carelessness with his actions. So let's talk a bit more about the interference with the RCMP. I'd like you to make some comments about that, if you would.
Well, that again, people who know Canadian politics, I want to apologize, but I'll simply say I regret that it's not so fascinating that the people who listen, the range of viewers that you have, may not be as intimate with it as we would wish, or I don't know if I'd wish it on them, but nonetheless.
Well, it's a good example of fascist collusion, though, I would say, and that's a threat to everyone in the West.
Yeah, but it also has a great precedent. The biggest scandal in terms of principle, in terms of something fundamental, something that reaches to the rule of law, came a couple of years back when he had an attorney general. I mentioned her already, the indigenous lady from BC. I'm getting her name fooled up in my head for just a second. She took a stand that SNC Lavalin should not get special provisions. And she was, she was the attorney general. And yet people from his PMO office, himself, the highest civil service, cabinet ministers, kept pressing her to change her mind. She warned the prime minister, if you are attempting to influence an attorney general, who is a singular position in any cabinet, if you are attempting to, this is terrible. So for 8 or 9 months, she resisted. She said, no, the rule of law can't be politically interfered with. Now, this was a prime minister and his office and aides and ministers attempting to bend the operation of justice in Canada. Eventually, Ms. Raybould gets fired, or basically leaves herself, and another fine female cabinet minister went with her. But after a bit of a flutter, even though he denied any influence, he said it in the Globe Mail, the story is false. It was proven to be true. Jump ahead 2 years, and now you find out that after the worst mass casualty of that kind in Canada, the murder of 22 people in Nova Scotia, that the Prime Minister's office and his political aides are pressuring or asking or telling the head of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki, to get information from the investigators in Halifax because they were bringing in gun control legislation next week. In other words, they wanted to absorb some of the emotional context and the high sensitivity of a singular tragedy so they could advance a political agenda, and didn't mind pushing, and she didn't mind agreeing to put pressure on a Halifax investigation. Now you hear back and forth that that Mr. Lambert, all the relevant cabinet ministers, oh no, Mr. Trudeau had to really find the thing. We put no undue influence on the RCMP. There's only one word in that sentence you have to pay attention to. It's undue.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And
yeah,
so,
well, Rex, this is all a pattern as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it is.
And I'm speaking as a clinician here, although I hesitate to do so, but I've been watching Trudeau for a long time. I found it appalling. I found what he was doing appalling right from the beginning, because Trudeau was enticed into running for leadership as a consequence of what I would describe as a successful appeal to his overweening narcissism. He had none of the education or ability or experience necessary to do something as complex as lead a modern country. And it was obvious to all, and it should have been obvious to him, that the single reason that he was picked by the utterly cynical Liberals who chose him was, first of all, his pleasant personal appearance, and perhaps not first and foremost, but first and foremost, his name, Trudeau, the dynastic name, the fact that he already had broad-scale marketing and sales appeal. And that was enough for him to justify to himself becoming prime minister. And then, maybe you don't want to damn someone for that, because just because he was Pierre Trudeau's son doesn't mean he doesn't have ability. And so it would be possible that someone like that could take the humble approach and decide that, well, better him than some evil conservative, let's say, and that he could carefully learn to be competent and to do a good job. But instead, he leapt into the fray immediately, appointing 50% of his cabinet as women, even though they were only 25% of the MPs, and thereby perhaps fatally impairing the qualifications and competence of the cabinet, and then doubling down on his idiot ideology, DIE, let's say, diversity, inclusivity, and equity, plus a bit of environmentalism on the side and a hatred for the energy industry. And he's been fiddling that fiddle ever since. And this theme of narcissism, which I think is apt, permeates everything that he does. The admiration for China, the dismissiveness that he manifests when he's ever asked questions, the overweening legislation like Bill C-11 that he passes without a second's consideration for the fact that maybe we could use some checks and balances in the governmental system on the off chance we might not be 100% right about all our ideological presuppositions. The fact that he basically ignores Parliament, and now that he's made it virtual. And then we could add to that as another one, Rex, which I think is very interesting, the fact that he denied unvaccinated Canadians, about 6 million of them, the right to travel, which is a big deal in a country like Canada and a big deal in other countries as well. But not only did he do that, but then when every country in the world virtually had released people from the COVID mandates and relaxed the impositions they'd put on their rights, he did not release Canadians from that travel ban until months after there was every bit of evidence that it should have been done. And all I can say about that was that was sheer bloody narcissistic malevolence. There was zero excuse for that. And the mere fact that he didn't rescind that policy months ago, that in itself should have been enough for the government to fall. And if Jagmeet Singh had an ounce of spine or sense, and he has neither, he would not be supporting this government in the manner that he does, especially given the putative NDP, what would you say, affiliation for the common working man, which is a complete bloody bunch of rubbish. Those days are long gone. All the union guys are out of the NDP. We have an elite set of utopians whose presuppositions make the liberal idiocy look almost like nothing in contrast, and the self-righteousness and moralizing that goes along with that. And so, Rex, why do you think Canadians have found themselves in this position, and why isn't there more broad-scale outrage, if not rioting in the streets, about what's happening at the federal government level?
Well, there are two or three things that I could say that are, I think, fairly relevant in this context. The first thing is that when he first came in, by the way, whether it's narcissism or not, that being as it is a clinical as well as a poetic term, I don't think there's much doubt of it if you're using it just in conventional lay language. Why you would install as the leader of the country. Well, it came also because the Liberals had been so ill-advised when they picked up, for example, Mr. Dion or the traveling political salesman, Mr. Ignatieff, who left, incidentally, within hours of losing and never even said goodbye. Sometimes the appetite for novelty triumphs over any prudence or consideration of forethought. But having seen him for the first term, and having seen the glorious appetite for display and for the gesture, whether it's, doing some yoga stand on a bench or making sure that you show up in the right mood at a certain event or attending the Pride Parade. There's no single symbolic gestural action that he ever avoided. And he signaled time and time. It is in the early days especially, it was a government of signals. That he was also a semi-celebrity. Vogue magazine did a thing on him. And the Canadian press had a wonderful way. I never understood how supine they could be so quickly. They talked about, when we were having some dissatisfactions with the U.S., that he was on a charm offensive. And that a charm offensive would disarm either Mr. Trump or whomever it was that he was dealing. Now, you asked a deeper question. In the early days, yes, you could put it up. Why are Canadians not more resistant? Well, two or three reasons are quite solid, especially as these things have accelerated and intensified, meaning the invasions of government into areas where it should not belong. There was this 2 years of the regime that more than any other provincial and federal governments imposed. You had the economy knocked to bits. We do not have an inventory of the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of independent and small businesses that gasped for air, that waited for the next in-breath, merely to see if they could make another day in the last 2 years. You had relatives unable to see their elder parents or elder relatives. You had social, economic, psychological, and medical obsessions and anxieties that went from the intimate exchange of mother, father, daughter, son, to the broad scale. And during that particular period, I think everyone was somewhat off balance. And once again, the news media were not doing their job. They were all online. We must close everything down. And you could have an announcement in the beginning of the pandemic, as I've already referenced, that masks are bad. Actually, that came from Tam. And 2 months later, that you must wear them. And no one in the media wanted to collide those two contradictions and say, well, are you really as expert as you say? That's the first reason. COVID took away a lot of the energies that might have been invested in the public sphere and paying attention to politics, because so many other strains that are much more intimate and close were at play. Secondly, and I think this is really, really telling, that in the present 5 and 6 months, when this thing really has come to new levels, whatever was the deal that the NDP, which traditionally is really the oppositional, not the Conservatives, the NDP are the ones that really put the bite on the Liberals. So remember, the War Measures Act was the forerunner of the Emergency Act. What was the name of the man who, even in a genuine crisis, You could make a case that the apprehended insurrection of the War Measures Act could be justified. I said, make a case. And it was popular, especially in English Canada in that time. Who stood up against it? Who took the flack? Who took the bad public relations? It was Tommy Douglas, the leader of the New Democratic Party, saying it went too far. Mr. Trudeau, the elder, should not have that power. In a new world where you didn't have a genuine crisis, and when the Emergency Act was invoked, in my judgment, for spite and partisan reasons, Jagmeet Singh had already guaranteed Justin Trudeau would have no parliamentary interference. I don't know what's the deal. They talk about dental plans and a few things the NDP want, but I don't know the internalities. What was the discussion? What went on between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Singh that he would oblige them, meaning Singh, for the next 3 years and preserve them from criticism? This is the telling moment.
Well, it's quite stunning, isn't it, that the NDP can enter into a pact with the devil, let's say, and none of us even know why.
No,
it's like, what's in it for you, Jagmeet? Oh, nothing. Well, nothing doesn't seem like a very good bargain. So what the hell's going on behind the scenes?
Where are this is a really good question. The NDP does have some fairly vigorous and occasionally aggressive MPs. They certainly can take on the Tories when they want. And by the way, they love taking on the Tories. That's a big caucus, more or less, relatively speaking. Where are because the NDP does have that moral kind of aura. And people who join the NDP like to believe, at least, that there is a morality driving them that is of a different scale or of a purer value than the other parties. Why are they letting Mr. Singh so desecrate the central image of the entire... Why aren't some of the MPs in the party talking about it? And I also ask, when it comes to the RCMP thing or the Emergency Act, why aren't liberal MPs, even some ministers? Wilson Raybould did it. Why is it that we're not hearing from individual MPs? They've been elected by a constituency. They do have autonomy if they want to use it. They talk about caucus discipline. There's only discipline in the caucus if you accept it. And if you think a prime minister or a cabinet minister has stepped over the line, or the leader of your party is traducing the reputation of your party, then an MP in the NDP or MPs in the Liberal caucus will say, hey, Mr. Trudeau was going too far with the information legislation. He went far too far with the Emergency Act, and his attempt to put division, especially against the working class of Canadians during the trucker protest, that was most unseemly. We don't have opposition from the media in the main, and obviously with Mr. Singh guaranteeing Mr. Trudeau, that's how Mr. Trudeau could cancel Parliament for next year. This is the central dynamic of the entire political moment of our time. And I have not seen one major presence on the Canadian media scene. Sit Jagmeet Singh down 30 minutes and let's have the story. You have not seen it.
Yeah, well, that's unbelievable. And, well, maybe it's partly the fragmentation of Parliament, and so all the MPs feel isolated. And then I know from talking to Conservative MPs who didn't exactly distinguish themselves in terms of their courage over the last 4 years either, that as individuals, they're all terrified of being isolated and mobbed. And the fact that Parliament is fragmented and that the media, and the new media for that matter, is more than capable and willing to mob, we could use the former Attorney General as case in point, means that people on the MP side, the backbenchers, are cowed in a way that I think is unparalleled. So let's turn, Rex, because it's very difficult to cover all the scandals, and we haven't even touched on another one that's major beyond belief, which is that Trudeau has run up more debt in his short time in office than every single prime minister in Canada managed in total since the founding of the state. And the consequence of that has been an incredible inflation, asset inflation, especially in the housing market, and an unparalleled level of inflation. And you can add to that the consequences of his idiot energy policies, which have emboldened Putin and which have also produced an unparalleled increase in energy prices across Canada. And so we're also, and then that's not enough. That's not enough.
No.
So
no.
in the past year, I have tried to buy, for what it's worth, a new car, a couple of small boats, just fun boats. And I know that's a luxury item, but that's not the point. A snowmobile. I've tried to make a vinyl record, and I've tried to get Penguin Random House to put out a double edition of my book. Penguin couldn't do it because there's a cardboard and paper shortage. The vinyl record industry has an 8 to 12 month delay. You can't get a snowmobile, you can't get a small boat, and no one can buy a car. And the reason for that is the supply chains are so disrupted that it's cataclysmic. 1 in 5 container ships are trapped in ports at the moment because the ports can't keep up with the demand. We have no idea how badly fragmented the supply chains are, and that's going to produce a catastrophic outcome, especially come fall, because we're going to have a very difficult time moving enough food around the world, to say nothing of enough goods. And so we have a massive debt. We have an inflation that's starting to get out of control.
Yeah.
We have a housing bubble that's no joke. And we have supply chain disruptions, the magnitude of which have never been seen before, at least not in the last 30 years, and that pose a threat to the integrity of the entire world economic system.
Yep.
And so that also seems to be a bit of a problem that Trudeau has had a major hand in producing. And that's along with his stated disinterest in financial matters, because he said that explicitly. He has no real interest in economic matters. You'd never guess that.
In 2015, he said, and I can almost quote, "I'm looking you straight in the eye now, and I'm speaking to you honestly, as I always do." This is when he was going to have $10 billion deficits per year. That by 2019, we will return to a balance by 2019. Now again, pre-COVID, we can understand spending of a considerable magnitude beyond any promise during the regime of COVID. But the extent to which this government wildly, and we never did see, because again, he was operating from the cottage. He was walking down the steps of the Rideau Hall cottage rather than going to Parliament, all alone in a little covey of media people under a canvas tent, and he was throwing out billions this way and billions that way. If you do not think that the billions upon billions upon billions that were flushed out without scrutiny, the Auditor General did not have adequate means to survey them, and he said that, and he asked for other people. We're going to have a harvest of scandals in years to come, but that's not the main point. It's the point that you're making, that the spending levels of debt and deficit were well over $1 trillion. And the Bank of Canada has already jacked up the interest rate twice. I talked to a financial man just yesterday. It's going to be worse and worse and worse. We have had a holiday from economic reason during this period, and he has overspent. Stephen Harper was correct. The spending during COVID may have been necessary, but this was overkill. I would say overkill with magnitude, and it was not governed. They're even now trying to get back CERB payments from 1 million Canadians. When the interest rates rise and people who have houses and mortgages start to learn what it is like to be in previously normal times, inflation hits at the worst possible moment. 2 full years of economic devastation because of COVID, because of the regime. They closed down things that didn't have to be closed. They killed businesses. We're going to see tremendous devastation across. And then the jihad against Alberta oil. That is criminally stupid. We are depriving not only Alberta, but the Canadian treasury during the return prices of natural oil and gas, highest almost ever. And we have made them, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Singh, Elizabeth May, and the cabal of professional environmentalists have made poor Alberta and Saskatchewan's oil and gas industry a demonic presence. How do you reach the level of political insanity that you kill a primary resource of your own country? You estrange and anger justifiably angry. They are justifiably angry. A whole province or two. And at the same time, when Mr. Putin, who scorns the green philosophy, and on that one, he's actually right, uses the genuflection to greenism of Europe and Canada to amass the power to use his gas, his oil, as a leverage to control Germany and to influence the operations of Europe. He couldn't be in Ukraine today if the green fantasy.
Right. And now to threaten the UK with nuclear destruction. And then let's also point out, shall we, that one of the consequences of the sanctions so heroically placed on Putin by the idiot West is that the ruble is at its highest level ever. And because oil prices have shot through the roof, Russia's actually arguably in some ways in better economic shape after the sanctions than they were before.
Yeah.
So that's just bloody brilliant as well. And this issue about what's happened on the Russian front is anybody with any sense looking at this up to, say, 10 years ago knew perfectly well that by dampening down oil and gas exploration in North America and in Europe, that we were playing into the hands of the worst impulses of the Russians.
Of course.
If you had to have your head buried in the sand or somewhere else to not notice that absolutely explicitly and to hand wave about idiot environmentalism while at the same time producing this potentially fatal dependence on Russian largesse and goodwill is an abdication of political responsibility that you'd have to look at history a long time to find an example that would supersede.
This episode was sponsored by Elysium Health. Elysium has dozens of the world's best scientists working with them, and 8 of them are Nobel Prize winners. They know aging science better than anyone. Their groundbreaking supplement, Matter, was developed in partnership with the University of Oxford, and it does something completely unique as far as I'm aware. It slows down the natural shrinking of our brains. Don't freak out if it's your first time hearing that, because I kind of did. Most people don't know, but our brains start shrinking after we turn 30, no matter how healthy we are, although a high-carb diet can definitely speed that up. And this shrinking can impact memory, learning, and even physical performance. Enter Matter, the only patented trivitamin complex that's clinically proven to slow the age-related loss in the brain's memory centers by an average of 86%. Many customers notice improvements right away in both memory and overall cognition. It's time to treat our brains the way we treat our bodies. Right now, Elysium has a special offer exclusive for JBP listeners. Go to explorematter.com/Jordan and enter code JBP10 at checkout to save 10% off Matter prepaid subscriptions as well as other Elysium Health supplements. Again, that's explorematter.com/Jordan for this exclusive offer.
I wish, and I wish with utter futility, that again, the guardians of our public discourse, the official and powerful press, would now forsake their deep and intimate marriage with the green movement that they've had for 25 years. If you watch TVO Ontario, you've seen an inconvenient truth, which was Al Gore's flush on the topic about 100 times. CBC is officially, if it hasn't said so out loud, is officially a Greenpeace activist network. I would like to see now them say, okay, this embrace of this virtue signaling hollow ideology has empowered the most dangerous dictator on the earth, the one with nuclear weapons. It has impoverished. Part of the reason for the inflation in our food at the present moment is because of the energy crisis brought on by the fatuous pursuit of energy sources that can't work, don't work, aren't yet developed, and don't have the structure or infrastructure, even if they were. I'm reading about the possible energy shortages in Europe at the present moment. I'm hearing of possible rationing of energy. We're hearing of the backups in the ports of Europe. You mentioned the cargo ships. All of this confluence comes to a central point, that the obsession, the false virtuous obsession with this manic fatuous ignis of global warming has perversely twisted the central policies of most Western governments. Canada should be energy independent. Canada should be selling its own, by other standards, well-managed oil and gas. It's certainly cleaner than Nigeria's or Venezuela's.
And Canada natural gas is a lot cleaner than the coal that the Chinese are burning. And we might point out that they share the same atmosphere as us.
Coal has made a significant comeback. It's not just China, it is also India. It is also in Germany. Because now that they realize that they are in a strangle loop held with one hand by Mr. Putin, they're saying, and by the way, the great Paris agreements, which was almost like the Council of Nicaea for Greenpeace, even the nations that signed that piece of folly are now saying they may have to retreat. But the biggest and the worst, we said never again, and we talk about horrors. The biggest and the worst was you gave Mr. Putin the leverage and the power through your self-seeking, pseudo-virtuous policies to be a new tyrant, to risk an invasion of another country, and to basically laugh. And by the way, when Boris Johnson and Justin Trudeau in a castle in Bavaria make jokes about Vladimir Putin, I think the guy in the Kremlin has been laughing well before them on much more substantial grounds. By the way, also, it is not seemly for the leaders of 6 democratic countries to behave like a bunch of adolescents in a locker room talking about whose jet is bigger or smaller, and also to basically mock the most precariously placed individual on the globe, Mr. Putin. Gerald Butts, Justin Trudeau, Catherine McKenna, and this ex-Greenpeace building scaler. We have 4 radical activists impressing their personal philosophy on a nation. And the cost of that, externally empowering a dictator, internally breaking up Canada, and overall depriving ourselves of our own energy independence at a time when it's starting to look very good, increasing the price of food, fertilizer being shortened. There is no policy that is so embracing and has been so recklessly dangerous as global warming. And that's his principal policy. You began by wondering about what was the problem. You know something? I think this make-believe, I'm going to save the world, that obsession in this particular prime minister is probably the most lethal semi-idea that he has.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I should also point out that part of the reason that Putin has been able to garner public support on his side in Russia is because he's been beating the radical leftist warning drum for 15 years. And very, 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 very directly. And I've read many of his speeches, and to what degree he believes what he says is open to question, as it is for all of us. But I've been inclined to note that in historical times, for example, people like Hitler wrote down very much exactly what they planned to do and then did it. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that if someone says something over and over, there's at least part of them that means it. And Putin has frightened his people into believing that the ideas that are obsessing the West, the radical leftist ideas that are obsessing the West, are akin in some sense to the ideas that destabilized Russia at the end of the Tsarist enterprise, and our obsession with diversity, inclusivity, equity, and this bizarre combination of sexual freedom and restrictiveness, in addition to our globalist, utopian, idiot environmentalism, actually constitutes something akin to an existential threat to the Russians. And the Eastern Europeans, by the way, are somewhat accepting of the same idea because they see these ideas in the West and they think, how the hell can you guys go there when we just got out of that mess? And so not only do we have an economic crisis and a political crisis and now a war that's precipitated by this idiot environmentalist doctrine, if you take the entire panoply of utopian nonsense, full moralizing utopian nonsense, the people who have an authoritarian bent like Putin are able to weaponize that in a very effective way to generate public support for their policies. And we can't even have an intelligent conversation about that now because people say even to bring that up is too pro-Russian.
You also can't have a conversation about any of those particular issues because if you talk about the folly of surgical intervention and transgenderism, you're a bigot. If you talk about any of the other ancillary matters that come under that ridiculous, look at the school board agendas of Ontario schools. By the way, this is a side point. In the essay, I don't know if you published it or not yet, when you were mentioning Dostoevsky and in particular the devils, when people adopt these fatuous and somehow or other overwhelmingly intense attitudes, they call them ideas, but they're more attitudes. The people of the world who have had experience, the people who've gone through, the Eastern Europeans who had to live under the dark umbrella of communism, those who have escaped tyrannical regimes, that lady you had on from South Korea, when they come over here now and they see what we're doing with our freedoms, which is essentially turning them upside down and mocking them, and under the name of political correctness or wokeism, insisting, pushing, propagandizing, evangelizing these toxically stupid ideas and perverting the education system in their Putin and the warriors of the world, as Edward Luttwak calls them, they're laughing their heads off because they know this is a form of almost collective dementia. We have, you wrote about it. We had the Supreme Court, the most recent one, the nominee, a black female, and so she was advertised. She would be the first black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. She was asked at her own hearing, what is a woman? And she said, I can't answer that because I'm not in 2022, 2,222 years since Aristotle and Plato and Christ himself, in the most sophisticated society that the world has ever known, a fully educated person who is also a woman is asked, what is a woman? And tells you can't tell. You have a 6'6" swimmer with hairy legs and other appendages beating women. You had a 29-year-old skateboarder yesterday, from the day we're taping this, beat a 13-year-old girl. And you're supposed to be too shy to say that if you've been 29 years a man and romping about with all your genes and testicles and everything else, you can't wake up the next morning and by simple declaration suddenly become a woman. These things they're mad.
I was in Austria and Romania and Estonia and most of all Albania. And I should say a few words about Albania on this front. I mean, the communist catastrophe under the Stalinists was widespread and horrible beyond comprehension. And the worst of that occurred in Albania. And that's really saying something.
It is.
I mean, that place has 110,000 bunkers underground to hide the population from fictitious enemies. It was an absolutely horrific nightmare of a place, possibly trumped only by North Korea, and perhaps not. And all the Eastern Europeans I talked to, and these were classic liberals and conservative types in the Christian Democrat sense of the word, are appalled by the grip that the progressive doctrine held by a very tiny proportion of radicals seems to have around the throats of the West. And the fact that it's compelling us into making, foreign policy decisions, let's say, on the energy front that are so absurd and self-defeating that we may have talked ourselves into World War III. Because, when World War I started, everybody thought the bloody nightmare would be over by Christmas. I think it started in the fall, if I remember correctly. This won't take long. It's like, and it reminds me of a workman whose sleeve is caught in a big industrial machine who thinks, it's just my sleeve. The rest of my body's still intact. It's like, that's just fine till the machine sucks the rest of you in. And we have a real possibility of that happening over the next year, let's say. And we should also point out, Rex, that there are reasonable projections that by the winter of this year, there'll be 150 million people who don't have enough food. And that'll be mostly in North Africa and the Middle East. And what that'll mean is tremendous, not only that starvation, privation, and horror that goes along with so-called food insecurity, but we're going to have a migration issue into Europe again that'll make the last one look like nothing. And so all this false moralizing, right, this false reputation enhancing, I'm going to save the planet by banning plastic bags, which actually turn out to be quite useful if you want to carry things, by the way. All of this false moralizing might have fatally compromised us already. Supply chain problems, massive increasing debt, a looming fertilizer shortage. The Russians destroyed a major Ukrainian grain port 2 weeks ago. And the Russians and the Ukrainians, they provide a lot of the world's edible wheat and a tremendous amount of its fertilizer and other edible oils. We're really playing with trouble. And then we get the spectacle of the G7 leaders, as you pointed out today, sitting around the goddamn table exactly like immature high school kids cracking jokes about Putin and his macho posturing. It's like, Jesus, Rex, well, that's on the international front. And our prime minister is the prime example of everything that's wrong that's got us into this mess.
It is such a coagulation. It goes from local things, as I mentioned. Jonathan Kay has a very good service going on his Twitter feed, which is very rare. I'm not saying it's rare for Jonathan Kay. I'm saying it's rare for anything serviceable to be on Twitter. And then he keeps track of some of the school boards and their daily pronouncements on the things that most count to them. I've talked to several people who have children in the schools in Toronto and outlying areas, and this wokeism, this insane, extreme progressivism, identity politics, the revelation of sexual identity as being the only. You look at this and you say you're destroying a whole generation. Well, as I said, the kind of coagulation of all of these factors and all of the most prosperous governments and most technological governments in the world suddenly throwing away their own expertise, throwing away the common experience of centuries, degrading their own capacity in terms of providing food and energy. By the way, there's another element too, under the same impulse. This idea that a certain cohort of the present-day citizenry leaders can turn around over their shoulders and spit at and degrade all of the leaders that came before them as if they are the only generation. If you threw Justin Trudeau back to the period of John A. Macdonald, he wouldn't have Macdonald's competence, but do you think he'd think any differently? The West, as a whole, our education system, the universities, and especially politics and journalism, I've never seen it so vagrant, so permeated by falsity and pretense, and by the engineering of attitude in place of ideas, and the fear of contest, that if they hold a position, it has to be sacred and you're not allowed to contest it, or you're all of those kinds. The drowning of intellectual challenge and exchange that is then applauded. That's C11, that's wokeism, that's the universities, that's the school boards.
Well, so Rex, I spent yesterday reading about a third of Klaus Schwab's book, The Great Reset. I'd glanced at it briefly, but I hadn't read through it. I read it in some detail, only the first third, and it was it's a remarkably vacuous book. There really isn't an idea that's solid in the whole first third. There's a lot of hand-waving about how the future might be optimized if the global elites just got their act together, and the pandemic crisis offers an opportunity for a massive reorganization, but it's very, very low resolution and vague, just as you'd expect, given that it's driven by an ideological agenda. And I want to say two things about that. The first is, who the hell is Klaus Schwab? And who elected him emperor of the world? Second, the fact that he's brought these elite types to Davos repeatedly for their globalist conferences particularly appeals to people who have vague ideologies that can't be tested against the real world without failing, and who also have a very powerful narcissistic drive. And so that's another bit of evidence in relationship to our prime minister about exactly what motivates him, because he's certainly willing to put his allegiance to the world-saving mission of the Davos types and the globalization that goes along with that and the Tower of Babel that is necessarily built under that. He's certainly willing to prioritize that over such mundane concerns, let's say, as monetary policy. And so all that's pointing in the same direction. I was afraid when we first elected him that he might have a narcissistic twist, because I couldn't understand how he could conscience running for leader given his lack of qualifications. It either meant he didn't know he was unqualified, which meant he was too ignorant for the job to begin with, or he did know and didn't care. And either of those are bad, although, he could have learned but didn't. And then when you combine that with the grooming that's taken place at the hands of Klaus Schwab, then you also see that narcissism in action. And so, anyways, I wanted to let you comment on that, and then maybe we'll wrap up.
Well, I think the broadest point to come out to extend outward from Trudeau, and we have seen it all through history, but in 20th century history and the beginning of this one, that when people, for whatever reason or drive, attach themselves to a slender but overwhelmingly large idea, global warming. And communism is a darker, but at the same time, not necessarily more malevolent over time. And once they think themselves the embodiment of this world-saving cause, it obviously must fill a tremendous void in the personality that suddenly your life is empty and everything else. Well, but now I'm actually saving all the world, and because I am saving the world, any objections, contests, arguments, or damage that it does doesn't matter. But I'd like to, if we're at the wrap-up point, I'd like to just veer to a certain other thing. I've talked to a lot. I've been in Saskatchewan at a fairly big meeting, people involved in gas and farming and other places. I've been talking to people in Newfoundland. That list you provided, the various topics we've rushed through and haven't really had the chance to fully elaborate. There are so many people in this country who have sunk. I'm not speaking economically, although that's true as well. They've sunk in the confidence that was almost a reflex when they dealt or thought about their country, Canada. There was always almost a hesitation in the voice when they would speak of their country. But the shocks and the abuse, the invasion of or the importation of these strange, alien, pseudo-academic fascinations from the various studies departments, the grievance mongers, and the woke fantasists, the constant pushing of nonsense and ill policy at the general citizen has hurt the psychology of the general citizen. It has weakened the texture of the country. And as we're taping this, we're days away from Canada Day. I can't remember a period in which Canada Day itself doesn't have, I can't remember a day, we will have so little of the easy exaltation and celebration that it used to have. We celebrate secular things, Pride Day, with far more vigor and easy acceptance than we will have Canada. In fact, I think it's in Winnipeg that they decided that maybe this year, because, we are such a feeble people and we are so evil, we won't have a cat. You cannot constantly castigate your own country and its own history without reservation and posture with these silly philosophies without doing deep damage and, I think, psychological hurt to the citizens of the country.
Well, look, Rex, I think that's a good note, although a very sad note to end on. I appreciate your time, man. And
no, I appreciate your time.
It's a hell of a litany of catastrophe to run through in an hour and a half. And I think Canadians have a hard choice in front of them. They can either wake up and see that they have a juvenile, an unqualified juvenile, occupying one of the most important positions in the administration and legislation of the world, or they can face up and face the reality that institution has become corrupt, along with the press, let's say, and many other, the education system in large part. That's a very difficult pill for.
Well, it is.
Or the people who, like us, who are pointing to these things are just wrong and paranoid. I mean, those are basically the options that are in front of Canadians.
And by the way, they're facing those options when the economic strife and militaristic strife are going to preoccupy the attentions, so that they won't even be able to get. We're heading into a very hard period. I'll make that a declaration, not a prophet, but the combination of all these forces means the next 2 or 3 years in Canada or elsewhere are going to be like others we have not seen.
Okay, Mr. Murphy. I imagine we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sir. You take care.
You bet. You bet. Bye-bye.